And you did refuse to answer any questions asked of you by those that were seeking it, right?
I don't recall that latter portion, if they ever reached out with questions or not. But I did refuse to be interviewed, that's right.
Well, an interview is questions asked and questions answered.
Sure.
And you refused to do that, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
So it was a refusal to do an interview.
Right.
Okay. What were you afraid of?
I'm not afraid of much. Let me say what I said right at the very beginning. The last several months have been characterized by a media frenzy, significant amount of it, from my perspective, generated by, among other things, misstatements of law from your own office.
But this was the Archbishop's investigation, not the media investigation, and that one being done by me.
Again,
So why were you
object
afraid
the
to
characterization
give,
of that.
why were you afraid then to give an interview to the Archbishop's delegate?
I do not characterize my stance as fear, but my prudent choice was in the then current environment, that my participation would add nothing not already available in the records possessed by the Archdiocese.
At some point in time, you're aware that we took the deposition of Archbishop Neinstadt a couple weeks ago?
I've heard that, yes.
Have you read it, the transcript of it?
No.
Archbishop Neinstadt indicated that at some point in time a decision was made to not record some conversations between at least yourself and him because there was a concern they could be discovered in litigation. When in time, if you did, make a decision to not record some conversations with Archbishop Neinstadt concerning childhood sexual abuse and the handling of it, so that they would not be discovered in litigation.
Again, I object to the characterization of what Archbishop testified to. It's in the record, and that will stand. With that objection, go ahead.
If what you've said accurately characterizes what the Archbishop said, then I'd have to be in a position to disagree with them, because to my knowledge, first of all, he and I would never have been in a position for much casual conversation. Archbishop Neinstadt managed largely by memo. And so just about any communication Archbishop Neinstadt and I have ever had probably is already available to you, especially if it's about these matters. But I don't recall a question ever being asked about recording conversations between the Archbishop and myself. So if he did in fact characterize things, Mr. Anderson, the way you've said, then I think he's wrong. But it sounds to me like that's a mischaracterization of his remarks.
Did you ever suggest to Archbishop Neinstadt that it'd be best not to document some of the conversations had between yourself and others concerning the problems of childhood sexual abuse and how they were being handled?
I believe not.
No conversation ever with him about that topic and not recording things, correct?
I believe that's correct, yes.
You're sure of that?
Well, I'm telling you that's my recollection at this point, yeah.
Did you yourself ever make a choice not to record certain things because you were concerned that our office would get them in litigation?
Actually, my stance usually, you probably didn't ever hear this because I didn't call you, but when I produced records, my tendency was to mentally invite Jeff Anderson into the office, presuming that I would be held accountable in the years ahead for my activity. So my general stance was to think in terms of what I was producing as one day being publicly available. And you, by the way, I offer you as a compliment, were part of the imagination I had in that regard.
Well, thank you for that compliment. When did you formulate that view that you should do that way with me in mind?
Sometime perhaps about 20 years ago.
Was there any particular instance or event that triggered that particular formulation?
Of course, you and I have had a great deal of interaction over the years,
Yeah.
and I don't recall any specific event.
Now, the charter in 2002 announced quite publicly that there would now be, if there hadn't already been, a so-called zero tolerance, correct?
That was the way it was often characterized. I don't know the charter itself said that, but nonetheless, that's an accurate public characterization.
That was certainly the public perception, the way it was promoted across the country and in this archdiocese. Zero tolerance.
I did not particularly use those words, but I recall it quite vividly, yes.
Did you believe there to have been a zero tolerance in this archdiocese before that time?
No, just as I've testified, during the 1990s, we continued to engage men, even with proven criminal histories of sexual abuse of minors, in administrative and some limited pastoral capacities. So I did not believe, no, that we had a zero tolerance stance prior to that.
Okay. And did you yourself have any participation in the Catholic Conference of Bishops that formulated the policy ultimately known as zero tolerance in 2002?
So I'm going to answer with two things. You say, I believe that the practices in the Archdiocese of St. Paul, Minneapolis, which I helped, although I was not fundamentally in charge of, but I helped to formulate, informed the work of the bishops. But no, because I am not now nor ever have been a Roman Catholic bishop, I was not part of that work at all.
Were you there at the conference in Dallas?
I was, yeah.
And at that time, as an advisor to Archbishop Flynn?
I was, well, I would always was an advisor of Archbishop Flynn, of course. So, but my particular purpose to be there was our presumption that he would be involved with national media conversations and that I could be available. We had just had a turnover in communications personnel so that I could be available to local media, given the fact that he was likely to be tied up throughout the meeting with other folk. Would it be useful to take a little break?
If you want to.
I would like, if I could, for just maybe
Sure.
3 minutes is all.
Oh, no, you need, take whatever you need.
Thank you.
It'll be a record at 9:56 a.m. Back on the video record at 10:04 a.m.
Father, have you ever told any official in the Archdiocese, or staff for that matter, to not document matters pertaining to childhood sexual abuse for any reason?
No.
Have you always considered yourself a mandated reporter while a priest?
This is, of course, mandated reporter of child abuse or endangerment? Yes.
Yes.
Well, always. I think I only learned of that sometime in the first few years after ordination.
And what, as a mandated reporter, do you consider the criterion for having to make a report as required by law to be?
Okay. Perhaps I can give some history.
Well, just
Please.
what your understanding of what the criterion is for triggering a report.
Right.
What do you understand that to be?
My understanding from the law is that if we have reason to think that a young person is in danger now, which would include, my understanding, criminal activity or potentially criminal activity that's happened in the last 3 years, that we don't try to establish the veracity or not of that. We simply turn that over to the public officials.
So where did you get that last 3 years as a criterion?
That's my understanding from the law, but that's years ago since I...
Is that your interpretation of it, or an interpretation given you by somebody else?
I think I might have even seen, well, yes, actually, so you'll get the history. In about 1988 or 89, Father O'Connell and I met with the head of the sex crimes unit for St. Paul, a fellow who subsequently went on to be the sheriff in Washington County. I'm sorry, I don't remember his name. And we asked him, what do you want to know? What format do you want to know it in? How do we report to you? That was a very useful conversation and it formed our practice thereafter.
So let me interrupt you, because the question was, when did you come to that interpretation? Was that 89?
I think it was 88 or 89. Then thereafter, sometime in the first half of the 1990s, I don't recall the exact time, but my colleague then, Bill Fallon, who was chancellor, contacted the county attorneys in the 12 counties that the Archdiocese serves and asked for similar clarification, direction, instruction. Now, so I wasn't part of those calls, but I encouraged him to make them and then heard the reply back, and I believe about 7 or so of the counties gave us something similar to what I've just said to you.
So is it your belief today that a report is triggered only if there is a current danger or one that has existed in the last 3 years?
Oh, you were asking about mandated.
Yes.
Yes.
For a mandated
so
report.
for mandating, my understanding is that, yes.
What do you understand the timing to be for making such a report?
Immediately, which means, as I understand it, within 24 hours.
Have you ever not made such a report?
When I was mandated to do so, I have never not made such a report. I'll put it positively. I've been aware of my responsibility as a mandated reporter and have always followed through on that responsibility. I've also advised as many people as I've had the opportunity to do so to do the same thing.
Have you ever advocated for the continuation of any priests in ministry whom you have known to have had histories of sexual molestation of minors? Yes or no?
Well, I'm going to give you a longer answer than yes or no. When the Archbishop would ask me under the previous policy about whether he ought to, what kind of assignment he ought to give to a fellow, I did provide advice at various times about the kind of policy, the kind of assignment that be consistent with the policy Archbishop Roach had approved. So yes, I did. I wouldn't call that advocate, but rather I responded to my Archbishop's request for perspective.
In connection with what priest and what Archbishop?
Again, this would be primarily with Archbishop Roach. I don't recall that it ever happened with Archbishop Flynn.
And do you recall what priest?
Do you know, I don't. I do recall one, Jerome Kern.
Did you advocate his removal from ministry or his continuation in ministry?
I eventually advocated his removal from ministry in 2002. Some handful of years before then, I suggested when Archbishop Roach, I believe, wanted to move him from a pastor position to an associate pastor position, the conditions under which the Archbishop ought to do that.
I took the deposition of Jerome Kern yesterday. Are you aware of that?
I am.
Yeah. What documents did you review in preparation for this deposition today?
Didn't review any documents to help my memory of this.
Have you reviewed anything in preparation for this deposition?
Other than
You don't have to answer that. He's answered the question.
Yeah.
Well,
He told you that he didn't review anything to refresh his memory, which is what he's obligated to disclose.
well, the question is in preparation for this deposition, what have you reviewed?
I spent time in prayer. That's it.
Have you spoken with any of your fellow priests or any officials from the Archdiocese about it, or what you're expected to be asked?
No.
Would you say what it is, please?
Yes.
The deposition.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I have not spoken with fellow priests or with archdiocesan officials in anticipation of this deposition. Oops.
When you make mention of Jerome Kern, it's correct that he was removed or allowed to resign or retire in 2002 from active ministry, correct?
Yes.
And did you advocate for that at that time or
I did.
against it?
I advocated for his removal, resignation, retirement.
You did not advocate for his removal from ministry before that, however, did you?
I did advocate for his restriction in ministry. I don't recall that I advocated specifically that he be permanently removed.
There is no record of him having been restricted in his ministry before 2002, is there?
I don't have access to the records, but I would be surprised that if there were no such record.
Do you recall that in 1987, Al Mashad made an appointment with you and reported to you that he had been sexually abused by Jerome Kern? Specifically, Kern had been with him at the seminary and put his hands in his genitals.
I don't recall the specific year, but I do recall listening to Al. Yes.
And you recall meeting with him in your office where you had the Kern file in front of you and reviewed some of the material with Al Mashad, telling him some about Kern's history?
I don't recall that, but it sounds like what I would have done.
Okay. He reports, and the file reflects that there were reports that Kern had abused in 1969 made by two parents when Kern was at St. Mark's. And that was reflected in the file. Are you aware of that?
I'm going to just dispute one word that you used, and that's the word abuse. And in fact, what I do recall, and this is now from memory, I've not had a chance to review documents or files, so there's probably much more material about it. But what I recall is that while clearly Kern's behavior with these young people, and my recollection is the Al Mashad behavior was very similar to the 60s, late 60s report, that it was disturbing enough for people to call it out. That a question at the time was, did that in fact constitute child abuse? Now, it's years later, and I think we all have greater clarity about those things. The question at the time, as I recall, Jerome Kern characterized this as wrestling, like what he had done with his siblings. So in when my predecessor, Father O'Connell, in the late 1980s, rediscovered the 1960s information, my recollection is that he asked a local Twin Cities expert, Gary Schoner, to review the behavior and help us understand how credible was Kern's denial that this constituted abuse, but rather was roughhousing or play.
So did you believe Kern when he claimed it was roughhousing?
You know, I don't know that I believed it particularly. My concern was to understand it.
You also knew that offenders of child sexual abuse deny, minimize, and blame, correct? You knew
Yes.
that?
Yes.
You've long known that.
I've
'cause
long
you've dealt
known
with a
that.
lot of them.
Yes.
Right.
So again, when Al
And so
came-
did you see Kern's description of roughhousing or wrestling with these kids as reported by him to be a denial of sexual abuse?
Yes, I did
Okay.
see his report as a denial.
And so you believed him?
I did not.
Okay, did you believe he had committed sexual abuse then?
I was not sure how to characterize. So when Al came to see me, when Mr. Mashad came to see me, I sent the additional information to Gary Schoner to ask Gary once again, look at, here's another story like the one from that point perhaps 25 years ago. This one goes back at this point nearly, well, 15 years. How do we characterize this today?
Did you send to Gary Schoner what Al Mashad had reported to you Kern had done to him or not? Do you know?
I think the file will establish what's there, but I believe I did, yes.
Okay, but you don't know that as you
I don't
speak.
recall it, yes.
In the file, you recorded that Al Mashad reported to you, and I quote, he was grabbed by the crotch, the kid was aroused, and Kern reached inside the bathing suit after the kid was aroused. That's sexual abuse, isn't it?
I certainly would report that to the police today.
You didn't report it then, did you?
I did not. Wasn't consistent with what I understood to be the matters that public officials had told us they wanted to hear, so.
So in '87, are you telling us that that is not something the public officials wanted to know about a priest having done to a kid?
In 1987, I was not part of that, or 1988 or whatever. That was Father O'Connell. But yes, after our consultations with the sex crimes person here and with the county attorneys, took place at about this time, probably somewhat before. I had the understanding that they did not want to know about older matters. I'm certainly aware, I've heard now, that they'd like to know about older matters. But the instructions under which I was operating from the public officials was, we can't do anything with that, we don't want to know about
Do
it.
you recall telling Al Mashad after reviewing the file with him and hearing his report, after hearing his report, that you promised him you'd get back to him and never did?
Because that's a compound question. I think, do I recall that I promised to get back
Yes.
to him? Did I promise I never did? Or do I recall that I never did? I don't recall promising to get back to him, although I presume I would. And I do recall that there was subsequent interaction with him. So I think it's inaccurate to say that I never got back to him.
Did you weep during the meeting with Al Mashad about the history that you saw reflected in the file and what he reported to you?
I don't recall that specifically.
Have you ever wept hearing the reports of victims like him?
Rather seldom. I didn't want to mislead people with false displays of emotion, so my approach would generally be fairly sober.
Did you demonstrate to him in that meeting that you were upset about what you learned from the file, having reviewed it with him?
I don't recall that, Mr. Anderson.
The records do reflect that in August of 1993, I misspoke on a date, Father McDonough. The meeting with Mashad was in 1993, 1987. I said 87, I think.
Thank you, and I think I responded suggesting it was a little later.
Okay,
so I think
so
we're on.
that was my mistake. I want to correct it. The records reflect that he actually met with you on January 22nd, 1993, and made the report.
Thank you.
Okay. Apologies for that. The records also reflect that same year in August, Al Mashad, unhappy about the response, or lack thereof as he reported it, hired us, and I brought suit. And that was public. You recall that?
Actually, had you asked me if you had been involved in the suit, I honestly would have forgotten that. But I do recall that Al wasn't happy, Mr. Mashad was unhappy, and that there was a suit. I had forgotten that you represented him.
And at that time, Kern was still in ministry, unrestricted, correct?
That's correct.
And at that time, do you recall drafting a letter for Archbishop Roach to be read to the parishioners at Immaculate Heart of Mary, where he was then the pastor?
I think you may have some things out of sequence there, because I believe this is my memory of it. Again, the files will establish it. But after we'd consulted with Gary Schoner, Archbishop then directed that Kern should remain in ministry, but Archbishop Roach said, we need to talk to the people in the parish and let them know what's going on. So, and I'll tell you the factoid that has this burned in my memory. I went out for a meeting, several hundred parishioners were there. We said, here's our assessment, but you need to understand that there have been these complaints. We're told by experts that they don't constitute child abuse, that he's not a danger today, but we want you, abundance of caution, we want you to know about this. Now here's the factoid that has, why I think your timing is incorrectly stated, is that I believe that the very next day, the meeting was on a Sunday, as I recall, and that someone who'd been at the meeting went to his workplace and said something stupid like, there was a meeting at my church and some crazy person is accusing our nice priest, and the co-worker he was talking to was Mr. Mashad.
In any case, it was reported to the parishioners that Kern had been assessed, and it was also reported by Archbishop Roach, and I think a letter prepared by you, that Kern had denied it and gave the impression that Kern was innocent of having committed sexual abuse against Al Mashad or any of the kids, correct?
I don't think you're characterizing anything differently than I've already said, so I think just hold that up to what I've said.
And are you aware that the parishioners then rallied around Father Kern, believing that he had been assessed and determined to have been safe?
Actually, my recollection is, but this is a long time ago now, this is 20-some years ago, my recollection is that there was a rather robust debate among folks in the parish about whether he's trustworthy, ought they to trust him. And in fact, for some time he was assigned in a team ministry with another very well-thought-of priest named Father Custodio. And my recollection is that either Father Custodio or one of the trustees reported there was some serious questioning about whether he ought to remain among the people. So
he was ultimately allowed to continue in ministry, and there was consideration of several options, and one of those was to make him an administrator versus a pastor, so that he could be removed quickly if there was any further public disclosure. Do you recall that?
I think you're conflating a couple of things. That the appointment as administrator permits the Archbishop to remove a pastor without due process. That part I acknowledge. The notion that it was further public disclosure that would trigger that, I don't recall that was the issue. This of course was all very, very broadly reported in the media at the time. So I don't think there was, and in fact, well, I'll stop there and you can ask.
Let's talk about the public disclosure then made to the parishioners. It is correct that no public disclosure was made to the parishioners at that time, that there had been earlier complaints concerning Kern as reflected in the file, other than the one being discussed made by Al-Mashad, correct?
I'm almost certain that's not true.
Okay. Did you draft the letter for Archbishop Roach where he states, "I do not believe Kern abused anyone," unquote?
I don't recall whether I drafted that or not.
Is your position today that either the file or the history known to you at any time concerning Kern was that there was never anything that reflected actual sexual abuse by him of any minor?
I think I already said, and I'll say it again, I would characterize today his actions as abuse. I'm not informed enough about the law to say whether he would have been prosecuted at the time or not, but I certainly would say that's absolutely unacceptable for a priest. But my understanding through the 1990s was that Kern was representing his activity as a family pattern of roughhousing, and that Gary Schoner's opinion was that that was consistent with the man's then current psychological functioning.
Is it also your understanding that you and Archbishop Roach were choosing to believe Kern's account of the events versus the Hutmakers, who had reported in '69, and Mashad, who had made a later report?
No. Oh, that's not my understanding.
You did know that even by Kern's account, he had placed his hands on the genitals of Al-Mashad.
Do you know, I don't recall those details at this point. I'm sorry.
Your understanding of mandatory reporting, had that been either recorded or heard by you, would have required a report, correct? Or not?
At any time during this relevant period, had Mr. Mashad or someone else come in and said that this had happened to him recently, I would have got out of the room and called the police myself. This was by that point, a matter that was some 15 or so years previous.
What priests, other than Freddie Montero, have you, I think you reported Montero, didn't you?
I did,
Okay.
yes.
Other than Montero, who have you reported to law enforcement directly
Right. Let me just back up and
as
say,
a mandated reporter?
let me say that I'm not sure that I made the call myself. I may have, or I may have walked down the hall because I was talking with the mother of this unfortunate child, and so I may have asked the chancellor at the time, either Bill Fallon or Andy Eisenberg, I can't recall, to make the call, but
So
because I
let
didn't
me
want to
let me
leave the
just
mother
state the
alone.
question.
Yes.
Other
So-
than Montero,
Yeah.
if you made a report on Montero, but let's
Yeah.
not quibble over that.
Yeah.
But let's get an answer to this question. What priests have you personally reported to law enforcement
Yeah.
for suspicions of childhood sexual abuse as required by statute?
Right.
Just give me the names, if
Right.
any.
You know, I'm not recalling right now whom. I believe I did in a couple of cases, but I don't recall right now.
What priests, if any, have you instructed somebody else to make a mandated report on your behalf?
You know, I am recalling,
If
I am recalling, now there's a priest by the name of Mark Wayman, W-E-H-M-A-N, or two N's, I'm not sure. And in one case, I believe I called the South St. Paul police myself. And then a second matter, I then, I got a word from one of our education staffers that the principal of the school where he was assigned had expressed concern, and I said, don't call us, call the police.
Okay. Now,
So
my
that's
question was restricted to either you reporting
Right.
or you instructing somebody else to
Right.
make the mandated report.
Right. So I
And
think,
so if I'm hearing your answer correct, you're saying in connection with Mark Wayman, you instructed somebody to make a report? Is that
well,
what your testimony is?
I think my testimony is two things. I made one report, and then the second, I didn't have the information directly, so I instructed the other mandated reporter to communicate that directly to the police,
Okay.
which
so,
in fact happened,
so you made the report in the case of whom?
of Wayman,
And you instructed, or and the other one you're referring to is whom?
is Wayman.
Okay. So both reports are in connection with Wayman.
That's right.
Okay. Any others
In regard to this,
where you
right,
instructed somebody to make the mandated report?
you know, I'm not recalling right now, but I'm sure my memory will refresh.
When did you first compile lists of priests who were accused of abuse, credibly or otherwise?
My general practice was not to compile lists.
Okay.
So
when did you first compile a list, if you ever did?
I think what I've just said is responsive. I don't think that I ever compiled lists. And that you is addressed to me in the singular, I presume. Is that right?
Well, you or others working with you.
Yeah.
I mean, when were lists begun to be compiled?
Okay. It's a little different question.
Okay.
Yeah. I think the first time there was an attempt to sit down and really list all of these was in regard to the John Jay study in 2002 or 2003. And do you want to talk about this?
Well, we'll get to that. If it's 2002 or 2003, I'm going to ask you about something earlier. first, why didn't you, as the guy most in charge, at least as Vicar General, for handling sexual abuse issues, compile such a list?
Let me deal briefly with the assertion in the beginning of that, and then I will respond
Well,
directly to the question.
If I was mistaken, you're not the guy in charge
No.
of handling sexual abuse?
I was not the one most in charge. A number of us worked together in a team under the Archbishop's direction.
Okay.
So the Archbishop's in charge.
Okay.
That being said, why did I not do this work? Because it was a matter of going through the records, and so I turned to the Chancellor, who is the chief record officer of the Archdiocese, and said,
Got it.
Yeah.
I'm going to go back to the Exhibit 102 that we referred to earlier, which was the 1998 article where you're quoted. And I'll just read a part of it because I'm going to ask you a question. On the first page of it, it says...
Wait a second.
Could I ask you to hold just a second till
Sure.
I find it again? Yeah. Okay, I'm there now.
And in the first page, the last paragraph, it is written, for the first time, McDonough revealed the extent of the problem in an interview this week. Period. 15 priests in the Archdiocese have been, quote, credibly accused, unquote, of molesting minors during the past 50 years, McDonough said. So how did you get the number 15 in 1998 if a list had not been made?
I was regularly accessing the files, and so I think that was my own memory from accessing the files.